get into this work. So I've been doing diversity and inclusion work since the late 70s, and of course it's evolved over time. And so what I was saying is in the last 5 years, the subject of unconscious bias has become very topical. I actually have my master's degree in consciousness studies, so this was right up my alley. Why? Because what you do is you study the brain and you study the different parts of the brain, and we really focus a lot on the unconscious mind, because most of what it is that we do, the things that we do just as a course of living life is really programmed in the unconscious, the subconscious mind. And we don't realize how powerful that is. And so, of course, I've done some additional research to talk about how that affects our biases and our decision making, particularly as leaders. So, some foundational pieces on this. So what is it exactly? They're prejudices. And they're prejudices that are not supported by data, right? Why? Because the subconscious mind is not rational. And so we make judgments in favor of or against an individual or group. And the thing is, it's below our level of awareness, and we don't even know that we're doing it. So I want to test something out. So this is going to require your participation. Do you perceive that you have ever been slighted because of your gender? Raise your hand, raise your hand. Do you feel as though you've been treated as though you weren't even in the room, like being invisible because of, say, your age? Do you feel as though you've ever been subjected to a microaggression and it is attributable to something over which you have no control? It could be your appearance, it could be your body size, it could be your body language, it could be your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your physical ability. Raise your hands.
You said microaggression?
Microaggression.
What is that?
A microaggression is, they are forms of discrimination. It doesn't mean that it's unlawful, but there are forms of discrimination that are subtle and insidious, and they happen all the time. They're micro because they're not blatant,
Okay.
but they happen all the time. And if you think in terms of that happening, in the aggregate, it could have a big impact on your self-confidence. Now the hand is up. Now the hand is up, yes. What if I told you that the perpetrators may not have even been mindful of the fact that they were doing it? That they were discounting you, excluding you, may not even been a part of their awareness. And that's because that's where the unconscious bias resides. Let me give you a few more facts about unconscious bias. It's social cognition that affects our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. And again, in an unconscious way. And it occurs involuntarily, as our brain makes quick and automatic judgments based on past experiences, stereotypes, and personal background. But the main thing is 80 to 90% of the activity that is going on, as I said, in our brain, we are not conscious of. Isn't that interesting? I find that to be very interesting. So, the thing about unconscious bias is it's so deep that unless you have maximal disruption of your unconscious processing, it's always operating in the background. I liken it to electricity. It's always there, operating in the background. It's not until you make a conscious and deliberate decision to turn the switch on that the light becomes apparent. but the electricity is always there, is it not? Well, that's the way our unconscious biases are. They're always there. It's human nature. We all do it. It makes sense because it's a way that we navigate the world. It's a way that we process a lot of information by which we are being inundated through all of our senses. So in order to not become discombobulated, we do this sorting. If you don't have firsthand experience with, say, a group of people who are different or an individual who's different, you want to determine how to best govern yourself in relationship to the other. So you rely on what's there. Might even be stereotypical information, but that's all you have. And you don't have a whole lot of time because the person is right in front of you to do research. How should I engage this person, right? So the unconscious biases or the information or the programming that's there just influences how you show up and how you behave. And you know what? Because our group is so small, you all, I can take a question or two in between. We have a total of 30 minutes. I was going to reserve the questions for the end, but if you have a question right now, I will entertain it. Anybody have a question so far, a comment or a reaction? Yes?
I was just thinking about something that I used to do when I was very young. My grandmother used to love to have, she loved plants, so she used to have a garden with pots, various pots, and I used to pretend that I was a teacher. And she had to stop me from doing this because what I started doing was I started having good plants and bad plants, and I was beating the bad plants because that's how, in school, that's how I was trained. And she's like, you can't play with my plants like this anymore. It has nothing to do with people, but the unconscious bias that I had, it's just an everyday, and this started when I was very young. I did this when I was really very young, and so it's just amazing how quickly we develop these patterns inside of us, and it just manifests without you even realizing it.
Absolutely it does. And it's not until someone brings it to your attention oftentimes that you even discover that you're doing it. So I'm going to confess, I have a lot of unconscious biases. And how did it come to my attention? I have been widowed for a long time, and my daughter says, well, it's high time you get out there and you start dating again. So she spent one summer with me, and she put all these profiles up. You know, she signed up for all these online dating sites, right? And so she says, over the weekend, you're probably gonna hear a lot of pinging. And she says, so you have to respond, Mom. Okay, I will do that. And so I hear all this pinging and I check these messages. So I went on one of these sites, and they say, you know, you have 99 matches. I'm like, oh, interesting. And so, you know, there are these pictures that come up, and you can hit left if you're not interested, or right if you are. And so my daughter's watching me, and I'm just going left, 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 left. And so she says to me, what criteria are you using? She said, because nobody has made it to the wink or wave or send a message. What criteria are you using? And so the thing about transforming our unconscious biases, until you have a wake-up call like that, you don't do anything differently. So I said, I'm going to think about my thinking. What judgments am I making? What criteria am I using? So random, you all. It was so random. You live in Baltimore, delete. You took a picture in front of your car, delete. Random, but those are unconscious biases, right? And so, needless to say, I haven't had a lot of dates. So as I was saying here, you know, our conscious behavior is only around 10%. 10% of the time are we really mindful of what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're saying, we're being deliberate about our behavior. 90% of it, 80 to 90%, as I just shared, is below the surface. But it is always processing for you and it is always influencing your decisions, your judgments, and your actions. So, let's see how many you all have. Does everybody have a piece of paper? Grab a piece of paper and a pen real quick. Just to see if you have an unconscious bias. So what I'd like for you all to do is just write down 6 of your favorite letters. There are 26 in the alphabet, you get to choose 6. But now you do.
I do.
Right, Lee? Now you do.
Your initials.
Take care of
It wasn't first.
Ah, so that's where we're going. That's where we're going. All righty. So raise your right hand if one of the 6 letters is the first letter of your first name. Your left hand if one of the 6 letters is the first letter of your last name. Yeah. And so you don't even realize, like you said, I didn't realize I had favorite letters. And then you said your initials. Of course you're going to gravitate towards those letters. And that actually is a form of a bias. And that particular one is referred to as the affinity bias. The affinity bias, things that I resonate with, I have an affinity towards. And as leaders, this is really important because it manifests itself in the hiring decisions you make, in the promotions that you make, the people you surround yourself with. You may give folks with whom you have higher levels of resonance more access to you than other people. It is a part of human behavior to gravitate towards the folks that are like us. It's also referred to as a like-me bias. It became so bad after organizations started with their diversity initiatives. You know, early 90s, everybody's getting on board with diversity and inclusion. But nothing was really changing in terms of the employee population. And so a number of universities, University of Chicago being one, really studied this phenomenon. They published their results about 5 years ago in the Wall Street Journal. And they attribute it to the affinity or the like-me bias. And basically they say that we hire, we promote in our own image and likeness.
But isn't it natural to connect with people that you have commonality with? If it's, you know, I'm a native New Yorker, somebody from New York. If they have a child with disability, I have a child with disability. If it's somebody that goes to same temple or church or gym or anything like that. I mean, is that natural?
Absolutely, that's natural. That's a part of the human nature. That's a part of feeling as though we have a shared experience and we have some commonality, and therefore we can connect and relate. And I know you're here because we play tennis together.
Sure.
That's our connection.
That's right.
That's the affinity. She supports me whatever I'm doing, but that was a connection, is the tennis. So yes, that is a part of natural human behavior. And again, as I said, it's all about us feeling comfortable, us feeling as though we can relate to another because we have a common point of interest. We also refer to that as herding. So I'll test you all again. If you had, and you can only answer this if you have the opportunity to choose where you sat. When you arrived at the conference, they started ringing the bell for us to go into the main hall. How did you decide where you were going to sit? Just think about it. How did you decide that? Was it because there was just an empty seat? That means that you didn't have a choice. But if you got in that room early, you had lots of choices. So with whom did you sit next to? Anybody want to disclose?
I sat at a table with one woman there, and I knew I had never met her, and she was a woman of color, but I don't think that affected me, but I sat because she was someone I didn't know and I wanted to introduce myself.
Great. It could have been that, or it could be you saw that she was alone too and it was safe. It's more difficult for us to enter into a table that's already formed and we're the odd person out, meaning that we don't know anybody else at the table. More than likely, we would not do that. But if there's a table with only one person, oh, that's easy. They're an outlier too. We have that in common.
I wasn't here this morning, but usually I'll look for kind of pleasant faces, like friendly faces, sharing conversation, like any group table. If everybody's sitting there quiet, no one is, then I tell them not to gravitate to that.
And that's an unconscious bias. So you have a bias towards folk who appear approachable and friendly. And you have a bias against folks who are focused in on their phone and maybe to you, they appear to be antisocial. So biases manifest in myriad ways. It's just about tendencies, proclivities, and it's really all about us. Do I want to, like Lee, want to move outside my comfort zone and meet somebody whom I have not met before? Not all of us do that. Not all of us do that. So that was a conscious and deliberate decision as well. And so that was in the 10% of conscious activity. Okay, so there's also the confirmation bias. What do you think that means, confirmation bias?
It's when you see something that agrees with something that you already knew and you say that, see, it proves it. Yeah.
That's right. And so what
We have a lot of
happens?
that right now. There's a lot going on.
In my family alone, yeah.
So write a case study, baby, write a case study. And so, so what happens, you all, you may not think of selective listening as being driven by unconscious biases, but it is. We select out the things with which we resonate or have an interest or that confirms our belief or confirms our value. So that's another form of unconscious bias.
And then there's the converse where you see something that doesn't, I believe this doesn't agree with that, well, I discount that automatically because it doesn't agree with what I clearly am right about.
Absolutely, that's how it unfolds, indeed. And then for leaders, we really have to be cognizant of what is referred to as the performance bias. What does that mean? If you have relationships, as I was talking about, with folks whom it's just very easy to have a conversation. We use language like they're the right fit. Or when we elect not to hire X over Y, it can be, they're similarly situated in terms of their qualification, but this one I just think they'll fit better. Really what that is the unconscious bias saying, this person probably is not going to require any additional effort of me. We can communicate effectively. I don't have to entertain their diversity. So it's an ease of conversation and communication, so I'm gonna go with this one. And so how does it manifest itself in performance? Oftentimes you're not using objective criteria. With those folks with whom you have relationship and rapport and commonalities, you evaluate them on their potential, oftentimes. And then those folks with whom you do not resonate, it's their actual performance. That is the criteria. Do you hear the difference? And so it can create these microaggressions where people feel that they're treated differently or disparately because of some dimension of diversity over which they have no control. And it's really challenging for those individuals to affect change in those areas if they're not aware of what might be going on. All they know is that I'm being treated this way, but they may not have the understanding behind that, what might be driving that behavior. If they do, then of course they can engage in what I refer to as courageous conversations. But if they don't have that understanding, if they aren't astute enough to read that, you know, there might be this different treatment because of these unconscious biases, then guess what? They're impacted by them, but they don't necessarily get to do anything about changing them.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure, sure.
A lot of times people don't even realize it. So for example, I'm just thinking about cultures formed that way, office culture. And one of my earlier jobs, when people came in, I came in right out of school, so that culture was inculcated in us. Somebody else comes in at a later stage, they don't have that culture. So it's harder work to train that person because they're coming from a different place. They don't realize it, or if they do it in a very subtle way, they don't even realize that they're making it more difficult for other people, and therefore it's being taken out in some, again, subtle but very real performance bias way. Because if they don't recognize it, we don't recognize it, and then you leave, and then you're like, okay, I can see what happened now,
Mm-hmm.
and also see my role in how I played in it as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you want, can we open up our
Yes,
circle?
please.
No, you're not. It would be a crime. It would be a crime if I didn't broaden the circle of inclusion. I am the inclusion strategist.
And I just had a comment or like a question, because
Sure.
you mentioned courageous conversation. At
Yeah.
what point do you think that it's worth having those conversations with individuals? Because I've always struggled with that, like, is it worth actually going down this road and pointing these things out that they don't realize, or is it just better for me to find a better environment?
That is a great question. And my response to that, you all, is knowing your desired outcome. Knowing what it is that you want. And if that opportunity can provide for you most of what it is that you want, but this one little thing is happening, then you might decide, you know, I need to step up and have that conversation. But if you perceive that your personal goals and objectives will not be met in that environment, then you go someplace else. So you have to be clear on what it is that you want, and always stay focused on the prize, as I like to say. So I was coaching a woman for the last couple of months, and our contract ended in June, but I checked in with her to see how things were going, because in our very early coaching sessions, I said, you are not matched up culturally. She came from the Department of Justice, and she went to a nonprofit. And although they do legal work, they're a little laissez-faire at the nonprofit. And all she knows is structure. Federal government, Department of Justice. She is a misfit. And so they are evaluating her on intangibles, right? And she's had to be assigned a coach. I mean, that wasn't because of some altruistic reason. It was because she was not meeting their performance objectives, which had not even been clearly defined, because it's real hard to be definitive and objective about your biases. So they had a bias against structure and a bias towards more of a democratic, you know.
Did they recognize that structure was the thing that was, I mean, I'm just interested to know that the parties could even define that that's what it was, and didn't take a third person to say, it's the structure you all don't agree on.
And I brought that to their attention and said that it was a mismatch, and I said, and there's a dual responsibility for this situation. She didn't do her due diligence on the front in terms of really getting a sense of what the climate was like, the procedures and the processing, and how work gets done, like you're talking about, the culture of that organization, and they didn't do a good job asking the right questions, putting her in situations where they could see, you know, how she approaches work. Had they done that, then we would not be at this place. So at first, my recommendation was leave, because I really don't think you'll be successful here. And so she thought about it, and she came back and she said, no, I'm aligned with their mission. And the reason I stepped out of DOJ is because I wanted to do something that really made a difference. So my goal and the prize for me is to implement certain programs. And I can do that here. And she said, I'm just, just meeting with so much resistance, and I have all these barriers, and people are always evaluating my performance and sending me to management courses and assigning me to a coach. And all of that is diverting her attention from what it is that she really wants to be doing, which is achieving a mission. So it's a lose-lose, because a month has passed since the contract ended, and I said, checking in, how are things going? And I get a dissertation back. And then the client called for a debrief. What is your assessment of the situation? Is again, we haven't seen any improvements, so it's kind of like, did you earn your fee? And so, my response was, because I'm done with the contract, and they're not a client that I would work with in the future. Really, because it's just so disorganized, and there's a leadership void, and they don't even know it. And so I had made up my mind that I'm going to be courageous, and if they ask, I was going to give them the feedback. And so they asked me this question: on a scale of 1 to 10, would you assess the difficulty and the complexity of this situation in terms of turning this person around? And then I was quiet, and so there were 4 people on the call. Michelle? And so I said, I'm processing. And so in that moment, I was choosing. And I chose to tell them exactly what I thought. And so what I thought was, I said, I think it's about a 9.5 degree of difficulty and complexity. She will not be successful in this environment if the environment doesn't change.
That's not what they expected to hear today. They thought it was gonna be all about her, not about them.
I said, she's set up
Wow.
for failure. And so unless you get clear around your vision, your mission, your values, you establish the behavioral expectations to live out those values, it's a moving target. It's a moving target. Because she never knows what you all really expect. You've never even codified your values. It's after she gets on board and I tell you that there is a values conflict that you say, oh, maybe we ought to have some values.
Maybe they need some strategic planning.
Oh, they need lots of stuff.
But
So,
it sounds, Michelle, excuse me, is that both of them didn't do their due diligence. She was coming from the federal government with rigid standards and methodology, and you know what you need to do to succeed in all of this, going to a squishy organization that just doesn't have, and so they knew, you coming from the federal government, you've got, tight constraints on you.
I know, so that's why I said it was a dual
It
responsibility
absolutely-
on both parts. They didn't do their due diligence. So what I do want to leave you all with is, we can have a disruption of our unconscious biases. Remember I said you have to have maximal disruption? But how do you get there? You have to go deep. You have to be self-reflective on an ongoing basis. Usually it occurs something like this. You've exhibited a behavior, you've had some engagement. After the engagement is over, then you ask yourself, did I offend? Did I handle that situation in the most culturally competent way? And so in those moments when you ask those questions, it's an opportunity to increase your self-awareness. You then become much more aware in going forward, and you become more thoughtful. Before you speak, you will think, as opposed to just allowing the unconscious biases to drive your behavior, and then later on you have to retract what you said. It's already in the room. It's already in the universe. You can't take it back. You said it. But if you just slow your thinking process down and think before you speak, it mitigates those situations where your biases are driving your behavior. Test your assumptions. What was I assuming when I chose this person for the task force instead of the other person, although on paper they are equally capable. Walk through your thought process when you have a decision to make. Before the major decision, think about your criteria. Like my daughter said, what criteria you use? It was totally random. We don't want your thought process to be totally random. You may want to have a methodology. What am I going to look for? And then use trusted colleagues as a sounding board. Give feedback, because again, unconscious bias is so deep and so insidious, you're not even aware that you are showing up in the way that you're showing up. So once you set that intention that I want to be an exemplary leader, I want to be mindful of my behavior, particularly as it affects people that I'm leading, their self-confidence, even the quality of their lives, because if they don't get promoted, they don't get to that next level of earning. That affects people's qualities of life. So leaders have a real responsibility, because leaders have a lot of power to affect other people. So I'll leave you with this. When Socrates was going through his big interrogation, if you will, about the influence he was having on young boys, he said, an unexamined life is a life not worth living. And I submit to you that unexamined biases are not to be trusted. Thank you.